came to the toolkits idea and why do I think that helps us get around things. Some of you may come from technological backgrounds, may work in Silicon Valley or may have worked in Silicon Valley or whatever, or are partisans of what gets sometimes called in its acronym STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And so one of the things that happened to me as I got into this, so I start from a world history point of view, and I start widely based, as you heard, and I began reading the stuff on technological history, history of science, and so on, to see how it was covering things that were going on that I knew about from China or lands of Islam or Africa or other places. Were those discoveries referenced? And very often they aren't. It's very much of a sort of a Eurocentric view. It usually is a modernocentric view, so it starts maybe in the Renaissance if we're lucky, and maybe some of them start even later. And it's pretty much on the widgets and gidgets and how they put this together and why this way of doing it was better than that way and why this one took so long to be heard and so on. So the STEM approach could be usefully supplemented by, it just seemed to me, by having an eye on what's the global context in which things are emerging, because everything that happens in the world happens in a cultural context. It happens in an, as we know, in an environmental context, and it happens in still other ones that we could stand here and flap our jaw a while and tell you about. But the main thing is that the context really are very shaping, and it's a sense coming at it from a different point of view, from a world historical point of view. You want to ask yourself questions like, well, how come when Arabic numbers, which used to be called Hindi, as the Indian numbers, transited into the lands of Islam and thence to the world where they still stand, how come the 0 and the decimal point, which were also used in India, did not move? Right, so that's a very interesting thought. And there were cultural barriers to that, because the way you found out about Indian numbers, and particularly the way you found out about zeros and decimal points, according to people that I have read, has to do that they were embedded in Hindu Brahmin texts, right? So if you didn't know, if you were not a Brahmin, you were not invited to the party, and if you were interested in finding out more about zeros and decimal points and you didn't have Sanskrit, you were out of luck, right? So it takes a while to get sort of out of its swaddling clothes of a specific cultural site within Indian culture, and then gradually diffuses. And such that, just to finish that little anecdote, there is a very famous Muslim thinker who lives in Central Asia in about the 10th century or so, who is, I've of course forgotten his name because of course I am as old as I am, so you'll just have to bear with me, but maybe you won't even have noticed that I forgot his name and therefore we're on the same plane. Okay. So anyway, this lad does all sorts of amazing things. He makes major contributions to medicine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's a paragon, right? And so by the age of 14, he had learned all there was to know, he says modestly in his autobiography. And I had my students read this because it was translated, and the students commented, well, there must not have been very much to know, huh? Which was a fair point, right? However, what he accomplished nonetheless was quite wonderful. And so anyway, there he is feeling very proud of himself, and his dad comes in, he says, young lad, he says, I think it's time you learn the Indian numerals. Go down to the greengrocer and they'll teach you, right? So in other words, where things are carried in a culture is also different. So high culture, where people spoke multiple languages, not just Arabic, but other languages as well, maybe read still other languages, because this is a highfalutin intellectual group that knows various different languages and texts. So they might feel very proud of themselves about all of that. However, they wouldn't necessarily have the idea that the greengrocer would be the place to find out about Indian numbers. That is to say, Arabic numbers, quote unquote. So anyway, so that's one example. I do have to skitter along now. But so things get stuck, and that was the thing that sort of interested me. And I thought, I began to I was just teaching lots of courses to undergraduates, and I began to realize that this getting stuck or getting unstuck and getting put in what I'm calling toolkits turns out to be a very interesting thing. So toolkits, we could call them technological complexes. Half of you would leave the room if I insisted on doing that, probably, but we can call them toolkits as a better way of doing it. So there are, the way I'm coming at it here, let's just jump. Here we are in a globalized world, and we can do another jump of that and go here. We're in Afro-Eurasia, which is a sort of mega continent. It is a bunch of places stuck together, some of which got to be called continents and others didn't when they were handing out the rewards and slips at the end of the race. And so Europe gets to be a continent, even though Europe is no larger in square mile area to the Urals, indeed, than India. And India has as many major river systems as Europe. It has as many major languages that are indeed written before the British arrived as Europe. And so on. So why does India have to be only a subcontinent, right? Whereas Europe gets to be a continent, right? So there's that whole problem. Southeast Asia is about as big as India, particularly if we add in insular Southeast Asia. For sure it is, but even just taking subcontinental in Southeast Asia, it is a very large space indeed, and it's not even a subcontinent, right? Afro-Eurasia, Africa comes up poorly in this particular map projection that we're using because it's really quite a bit larger in real terms than you'd think. So I'm doing this as a little riff on world geography right now, just to sort of back us into another way of coming at these things. And Africa, depending on who gets to say, is 4 or 5 major different regions that connect to one another historically over a very deep time. When the Bronze Age was happening, it was happening in the Lake Victoria area in East Africa, quite as much as it was happening other places. Some places have iron and skip the bronze stage. Some groups use bronze for sculpture, but they don't use it for anything else. But so there's all these different mix and matches that are going on. Well, I'm going to back up, but this is part of my train of thought and train of screening, perhaps. Then we have the Americas, or we could have just called it America, because that's in fact what some Europeans do. And it is a very large space of its own. It does have civilizations. Those civilizations are indeed quite ancient. Some of them are on a par with the civilizations that are emerging in the ancient Mediterranean world, and we don't know much about it still, because global warming has not progressed to the point where we can actually peel back the layers of jungle and keep finding more things that are dazzling to us. It happens almost every day, right? So that's another huge space. It is largely out of the conversation that the Afro-Eurasians are having. And the Afro-Eurasians are having different kinds of conversations depending on the languages that they know and read. And those languages may some come filtering in the days before reading was a common thing, rather slowly. So they will only be part of conversations that are long dead in the land of their birth. So there's that little problem too. This is sort of the catch-up time. Or they may have made innovations of their own that don't diffuse very much because they are located somewhere that is slightly offline in terms of the pulsations of communication that are going across Afro-Eurasia. Right. So, and finally, just because I like to do it because it's, I'll get the hang of this for a second. All right, then there's what we can call Oceania. Australians can please stand up and cheer. Although I didn't call it Australasia, I think, which is the Australian term of so it's sort of, okay, so yes, you're a continent, but we didn't call you a continent. But when we look at the world from this angle, I'm going to go back to this the next slide, actually. Well, but when we look at the Oceania, let's just call it, what's important is that it is a vast space that immediately adjoins Asia on the eastern side, and that there were Polynesian and other peoples who were navigating the ancient Pacific, just to make a term, in the BCs, right? So this is a very interesting space in which lots of interactions are going on. Certainly, it is the case that Chinese sailors were bumping about in insular Southeast Asia far earlier than we know, right? And I'll be talking about that in the next lecture a bit too, because there is a famous Chinese mariner who in the 14th century has 6 major voyages. He goes to East Africa, he goes to Australia, he goes many other places, and his boats all have rudders. They all have different kinds of sails. They all have watertight compartments. They are put together with iron nails, and they all are steered with reference to a compass. None of which is happening in that time in the Mediterranean world. Right. So it's just very interesting to sort of see comparatively where it all fits in. And Chinese tend to look internally in their culture. They don't look at what Chinese are doing outside. So some of the stuff is not very well documented, not very well known. Archaeologically, lots is going on. More about that anon. All right. So back to Afro-Eurasia. Let's just see if I have to sweep up here. No, so basically, it's the intercommunicating zone is the main thing that I wanted you to hang on to from all of that. And I do like this map. And we're getting along here. All right, so let's talk about toolkits and the origins of modernity. And I'm going to try and be brief. I do know what time it is, and I think we're doing okay. So what's a toolkit? So there's various different ways of answering that question. How does it differ from a history of science approach? I sort of tiptoed up to the edge of that and then pulled back a minute or two ago. So let's think about that for a little bit. So the toolkit idea is one that actually is not original to me. I found it. It's used in different literatures, sort of professorial literatures, academic literatures, let's just call them. But so the idea of a toolkit is something that primarily comes from archaeology, right? So they talk about ancient peoples, very ancient peoples, like Native Americans and so on. And they talk about toolkits with reference to things like the Clovis points. Some of you may know a little bit about Native Americans and their culture and the way in which archaeologists have been looking at them. And so Clovis points are a type of arrowhead that's very distinctive. It has some particular advantages on other ones that are more clumsily put together. And they spread, and you can sort of trace the spread of it. And it used to be that the history of the native peoples in the Americas, particularly in North America, were referenced by the Clovis Point people. Well, now we know, and increasingly we're coming to know, that they were not the only game in town, that there were many other different groups, some of whom indeed may not have come over the Bering Strait. Oh, whoops, how did we get that one slip by us? So there's other things that are happening in the world of archaeology of the Americas, particularly the Americas that we stand up in. And therefore, stay tuned, because that history is in transformation as well. Okay, so the toolkit idea is the idea of particular sort of signature things that are developed in particular cultures that then get diffused either because of conquest or because of trade or because of that things happen, and gradually or not so gradually everybody gets onto it, and then it gets deposited into what I'm calling a toolkit, which is the archaeologist term, but I want to broaden it and use it in a bigger way than they tend to do. And so the water management toolkit that we'll be talking about in a little bit is a place where everything having to do with water and the use of water, whether it's too much or too little or at the wrong time, or various other quibbles about the water around us, and we are indeed in a planet that should be called water and not Earth, because that is indeed the dominant element around us. More about that next time too. What does it do to your head to think about the planet as being called water? Right? So anyway, that's sort of intriguing. All right, so history of science approach. I did some of that before. It's just that it tends to be written by people who are interested in technologies and not so much interested in the cultural embeddedness of those technologies. And so the toolkit idea is one that puts cultural embeddedness forward as being a rather more important thing, and the ways in which cultures can open or close in their willingness to tolerate different ideas coming in at different times. The diffusion of printing, which I'll come back to again in a later lecture, is interesting because that develops, as some of you may know, in China. A lot of good stuff happens in China, but it happens in a very peculiar context. So the context is, first of all, it's Buddhist, so it's Chinese Buddhist who knew, right? But this is in the period when Chinese Buddhism was actually high in the saddle. So it's an important period in Chinese history. They are putting Chinese language, which is a logographic language, which is also tonal. Hello, I mean, how many of you speak Chinese? Well, a couple of people, so a little bit. Yeah, you can order beer. And so the idea of putting Chinese as the first language that's we're going to be put into a printing press. So it means that you don't have an alphabetical system. That's the main point. So you can't tell your printer's devil, the little kid that's covered in ink because that's what his job is, to run around and find the A's, the capital A's. I need a capital A. I need it now, right? Because it's individual words, right? And they're done in wood. They're not done in iron, right? And then the back room of this thing, it's just filled with all the old ones that got jetted. Where did we put that one, right? So there's that problem, and then there are other problems which have to do with, well, who's going to read this? Well, Chinese people will read it. People that learn Chinese who may come to read it, but it's not going to diffuse very far. And then it's in a Buddhist context. So if you're not a Chinese Buddhist, well, you're not welcome to the club, although the state does quickly discover that for certain purposes, it is useful to be able to print things and send them around because it becomes part of the apparatus of rule. So you can send orders and you can have people make notes on who's behind in their taxes, and you can do the various things that states tend to want to do. All right, so the printing diffuses rather more slowly than you might imagine. Paper also has to be invented, and that's invented by the Chinese. And then it transfers across Afro-Eurasia. It gets to the lands of Islam, which were in their height. So Islam is in China. There are major Chinese groups that are Muslim, and Central Asia is very much populated by Chinese as well. I'm sorry, by Muslims as well. Excuse me, I gotta take a sip here. So the Muslims have the Arabic language has 24 letters. That's not so bad. You can print with that. However, it has medials, initials, and terminals. So depending on where a letter is in the context of the word, beginning, end, or middle, it has a different form. So we're getting into, well, this is getting a little on the edge of not being so obviously a print-friendly language. Plus, there is in all societies that have states, the further problem of what we could call, the lobby of the clerics, right? The clerics, the clerks, the ones who take notes, who sit in at the meeting and so on. And they are going to be out of jobs if printing starts happening. So they're not necessarily going to be keen to adopt this new invention. So between the two of them, paper comes across just fine, and I'll say more about this as we go along, but it is a stumbling block, such that when we get to when we get to Europe, because this is just the other one, this is these little anecdotes of the things that are so telling. So Gutenberg, quote unquote, invents printing, right? Albeit totally unbeknownst, because it's long since been invented and used in China, and and printing is something that, you know, that has its capabilities, but it's particularly well adapted to languages that have an alphabet, right? So there's that, and that sounds good, but then how do you do it? And so Gutenberg is talking to his buddies, and they, boss, we just have this idea. What if we get this old wine press? There's one around the corner. We can get it for cheap, and we'll bring it in, and we could do our printing. And so printing is actually first done with a deaccessioned wine press. Why a wine press, you might ask? Well, because when we have a wine press, what a wine press does is it exerts pressure that is even throughout, right? So letters are not going to be partly printed or not printed at all because of the contact with the paper. So you crank it down and boom, you're done. And so that's an example. Here we are back in toolkit land, right? So that's in somebody else's toolkit, right? So it's something that has to do with preparation of wine, which indeed humans have tended to like in most cultures. But somehow the idea that you could do printing using a wine press had never occurred before. Then they go, oh, okay, well, actually, this wine press thing is fine, but let's just see if we can make it better, right? So then we start the technology guys start going, and they say, okay, what about this? What about that? Boom, 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 boom. And here we are today. Okay, so that's that. So then the toolkits thing, I'm sorry, this is going on, but it is part of what we need to do, I think. And so it's the need for a global lens. So you have to be able to see all of humanity as intercommunicating conversations, thinking about toolkits as being little baskets that accumulate stuff that has to do with specific types of things. And what I'm contending, the bigger argument that I'm making in this series of lectures, and I'm going to try and continue doing it as we go along, because this is part of a larger project I've become fascinated by in my retirement, is to think about how modernity happens. And so I'll just lay it out there this way, that what happens on or about 1500, right? Depending on the toolkit, depending on various different things. The toolkits are all sort of filled. The cumulative efforts of Afro-Eurasian thinkers and actors and people who like fiddling around with things, all are accumulated in these different 10 major baskets that I'll tell you about. And then they're ready to go. And some of them originated in Europe, some of them originated in other places, but the baskets now are full. So particular problems that sailors had in the Mediterranean world are now obviated, because now we know about how the Chinese do it, how the people of the Indian Ocean world do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So suddenly we've got a bigger range of choice. Now the compass has been invented. It was invented in China, but it's in the basket, so you can take it out, right? And we don't have copyright, and so nobody can say boo, and nobody collects $1 million because you invented the compass. But so anyway, so that's how a global lens can help us. And the toolkits are interconnected with one another. So the mining toolkit is part of metallurgy. That's my toolkit for that. And so that's about digging in the ground and finding minerals and bringing them out, useful minerals. But, well, we just learned about how to make a tunnel. Well, that's good. So the water management guys can use that. And then tunnels can be used for other purposes. They could be used to go under fortifications. So suddenly particular inventions can be swapped around when some bright person goes, oh, what about this? Right. So the toolkits diffuse around. They are generally available, and then it magically, I don't think Mr. Columbus has a whole lot to do with this. He's not aware that he is the beneficiary of it. But around 1500, people can go, European people in particular, can do, oh, let's do this, let's do that, let's do the other. Gunpowder weapons invented in China. Sorry. Here we are again, those pesky Chinese. So, and then it all transits via the lands of Islam, and there we are. All right. So, all right. So keep an eye on this. I'll just leave that up for a minute or two while I have another sip of water, and then we'll carry on. I don't want to say anything about them, because if I do, we'll get even further in the mud than already. Okay, so general idea, general questions here. Let me just pause for a second, because why is something a toolkit and why is it not? You might want to ask, and it's somewhat arbitrary, but partly also things move around a bit. And so I told you with the wine press example and a couple of other examples, how things get embedded or not embedded, and they can be put to other uses by somebody who figures out, oh, well, how about if we did that? All right, so yeah, go ahead.
Seems to me that maybe instead of calling something a toolkit, we're talking about an idea kit.
Well, except it also includes technology, but it is primarily something that's in the head. That's a very important point. Yeah.
Yeah, but the tool means it's already been thought of, and it's the ideas of.
Well, some of them are actual tools, but
I realize.
yeah, but no, that's a fair point. Yeah, that's a fair point. And who knows? Like, finish tinkering with this, maybe we'll call it something else, but I think toolkit is pretty good. All right, so now we're going to get to the managing a water toolkit, and we're going to go through what's going on. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, you mentioned in civilization the role of religious, religious aspects. Would it not be part of the toolkit, or would it?
Well, so I hit the pause button when I got the particular cultural things
Okay.
for reasons that are not fully worked out, but I would be having an engagement conversation with you about, but maybe this is perhaps not the time. So if you're going to be coming regularly, more will come out. It's a, yeah, I'm going to just shut my mouth because it just tends to go into action, as we've seen. All right, so the water management toolkit, we can now say, is something that is very important. It is invented primarily in West Asia. Oh, but then we have to pause for a moment. What do we do with Europe? Is that part of West Asia? I think it is, right? Although it's a bit of a jolt. I'm sure Europeans are going to be very slow coming around to that particular idea, but it is part of West Asia. I mean, there it is. Look at the map. In fact, look at the map. So that's not, why is Southeast Asia, why don't we call it something else, right? So are there other questions? All right, all right, so we're going to jump back over where we were. And let's just talk about some of these, and I have some good slides, and so I think we'll move along as we do. So there are major places that water management is necessary, and the Middle East is part of a general area that geographers call the mid-arid zone. So the mid-arid zone goes from the Sahara Desert, Morocco, the Atlantic Ocean, all the way across to China. Right, and it's intercommunicating, sort of, kinda. There are mountains and there are places where there's really nasty deserts. But if you're interested in doing it, you can do it. Camels are not called the ship of the desert for nothing. So we can think of this mid-arid zone as being another kind of sea, right? If it's the ship of the desert, then let's go whole hog and just think about, well, okay, the boats are going here and there, camels are going there and there. What if we took the map and we repainted it such that we only put it where people are, and that where all the mid-arid stuff is going on and where all the water is going on, we painted that the same color. Then what would our map look like, right? So you start teasing away at an idea like that, and that's where you end up. All right, so everybody knows this, so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time, but the Nile Valley is particular. There is nothing like the Nile anywhere, and it is it calls up a certain set of water management toolkits that are quite ancient and that become more and more sophisticated as time goes on, and they're quite open to borrowing from others. But lots of what others have to offer are not relevant to the Nile, because the Nile is the Nile is the Nile, sort of like location. And then there's Mesopotamia. And so ancient civilizations, Babylon and Assyria, and who knows what all else you might come in and go in succession over millennia. And they are in a very different kind of context in which there is the Tigris and there is the Euphrates. And the Tigris is a nasty little son of a gun, and it goes a million miles an hour. It comes right away and it floods your downtown, and nobody likes it. But it is the one that brings the most water, and it comes fast. And the problem is, what do you do with all that water? And then the Euphrates is another kind of a river, which goes wandering around here, there, and the other place. It starts in Turkey, it wanders through Syria, it wanders through Iraq, and it ends up down in the Persian Gulf, or we could call it the Arab Gulf if people don't want to be offended. And so the idea that begins to happen is that ancient peoples begin trying to figure out how you can move water from the one that's got all the water that's coming fast, but comes in one season, and how you can keep the Euphrates going and move that. And so they end up with a kind of macro solution to this, just to use a term. So there's sort of bigger level kinds of decisions, and then there's micro ones, right? So the water toolkit also has meso ones, there's ones in the middle. But in any event, here we are in a situation in which, let's just click ahead. So I'm going to do the Nile and then we'll stop. Okay, then we'll have our break. All right. So the Nile flood arrives in August, which is not usually the growing season, but it arrives slowly and majestically, and it hangs around for a while. And people in Egypt, particularly in this period, tend to live within 2 miles of the Nile. So it's a total linear country, or space anyway. And so the idea is we need to keep this water here. We need to keep it useful. We need to impound it. Once it gets high, we need to have banks or something that we can open to allow the flood to come through, and then close those banks, and then use it as a kind of a pond, a giant pond, that we can move water from here to higher levels. So a lot of it has to do with moving water up and down, but the down takes care of itself, but the up part gets to be tricky. And then how do you diffuse it into your fields, right? And all this is going on, so you can use the water of the Nile for long periods. They get, they get 2 growing seasons regularly, and third growing season comes along by and by. So this is what's called the basin irrigation system, and it has a whole bunch of very specific kinds of water lifting devices. Let's just see. There we are. So here's some views of fields, pyramids in the upper right hand corner with people. The Nile is on your right. That's this one over there, and then where the water has been lifted to is up above. So let's this. Then there are these different kinds of water lifting devices. So the one on your left is what's called an Archimedean screw, right? So this is a Greek invention, maybe, or just the name is, and maybe the bare bones of what it is has already been invented. But Archimedes comes along and throws his patent on it, and everybody goes, "Oh man, score, Greeks!" And then the other is a more humble looking kind of a device, but nonetheless effective, and it allows you to, with a balance, to lift the water and then move it around and deposit it somewhere else. All right, so Tigris Euphrates, we will stop. So we did. I withdraw the apology. Okay, no harm, no foul. There we go. All right, so off to the races. All right, so anyway, so I already sort of tipped my hand on the Tigris Euphrates, which is that it's a complicated system of 2 rivers that are very unlike. Neither of them are in any way like the Nile. And if we wanted to get fancy, we could add in the Karun River, which is down in the sort of parts of southeastern Iraq and parts of southwestern Iran, I suppose we would call it, or Persia these days. That's another river that's part of that larger complex. All right, so just to know that that's what's going on. There's a wonderful picture of water wheels in Hama. Do they still exist? Hama is a city in Syria that got rather pulverized in the struggles that have been going on. But let us keep our heads in the past and not get in trouble. All right, so lots of larger scale technologies are developed in ways that are quite different from what was going on for the Egyptians. And it's, if you give me a moment here, I think I have to actually poke around and find my actual notes, just so I don't get things wrong. Okay, so so Mesopotamian empires come and go over successions of times. There are many different things about them that we could dwell on, including their wars of conquest and their delight in advertising what they have just done to their neighbors. But we won't actually go there, nor will we talk about their religion. We're into the toolkit part, and we're particularly into the water management part. So that's what we're going to do. And the thing here that is so intriguing is that so the damming rivers becomes really a very important thing for survival. Iraq is nothing like what it is today, right? I mean, today temperatures in the Middle East, even though it is occasionally mentioned in American newspapers, are getting so that they're 50 degrees centigrade on a regular basis. I mean, it's unlivable, right? Absolutely unlivable. And if you think refugee production by war is an efficient way of doing it, a far more efficient way of generating refugees is to have the temperature go up to the way in which it is. And this is, we are not even thinking about it. We're not talking about it. Everybody that is has picked sides in the Middle East between this and that and the other group, and it's a complicated thing, and you have to keep adjusting your sides because then the other guys do something. And but wait a minute, they have an ally with these people. They didn't used to have an ally with them before. What is that going to do? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Drive you crazy, right? That's what I did for a living. As part of that, I used to run all the teachings at the university whenever something bad happened in the Middle East. So it was full employment all the time. And you just, that is not what's on the menu here either, right? So Iraq was a rather more gentle kind of an environment, but it's still, and the mountains around it had lots of rivers in them. I'm sorry, rivers in them, and they also had lots of forest in them. And so it presents as a different kind of an ecological system than the one that we know about these days. So the ecology is one in which there is definitely aridity is still very much a thing, although with some water and some application of energy by humans, agriculture can flourish, right? And so that's the key little discovery that is made by the ancient Babylonians and those who come before, right? So it's the water management has to do with the transition from more mixed kinds of human societies to let's just focus on farming, folks. That's going to be the way out, right? And so agriculture becomes a very important thing. That's another toolkit. We could say it's very much part of the water management toolkit also. Indeed, maybe it's the whole reason to have one. And so in the case of Mesopotamia, damming of rivers becomes an important thing, and even more important is canaling. All right, so those of you who have a little technological knowledge about moving water around on a property in California or elsewhere will know that gradient is the key thing, right? And so you have to be able to make gradient slope very, 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 very gently so that the water doesn't all go in a great rush. But that it goes reliably, and so that's an engineering thing in itself. Just to be able to figure, oh, we have a gradient problem, and then how do we address this gradient problem? Ancient peoples were there, right? So that's the interesting thing, and Mesopotamia is part of the deal, and the land does slope, you know. So so Mother Nature is bestowing some benefits in that way, but. Anyway, canals are built and rebuilt, and by the first millennium BC, there are canals that are being built that are 200 miles long that go between the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? And so this is long before Chinese canaling is ever comes along. Chinese canaling is in the Tang and Sung period primarily, so it's like 400, 500, and thereafter in the CEs. which used to be called the ADs before World History got a hold of it. Sorry about that. Got to break some things. Yeah. So anyway, so the Tigris-Euphrates then has this array of solutions to water problems, right? That are all part of a Mesopotamian toolkit. But the Nile toolkit, they could care less. None of it applies to them, vice versa, right? And then the building of reservoirs is another element of this. So hang on. Just to say, while we're talking about Mesopotamia, I thought I'd throw this in because it's a lovely picture, and I've actually seen this spot. But the Pont du Gard is in southern France, and this is aqueducts. So aqueducts have been invented in the ancient Middle East, and the Greeks do their own building of aqueducts. Probably Minoa and the island in Crete in the eastern end of the Mediterranean is a place that is most in advance in hydrology of all kinds. But I don't know very much about that. I've tried to inform myself. It's not something that seems to have popped up too much. If you find out things or if you know things, send me a note and I'll be happy to look. All right, so let's just carry along. So reservoirs and tanks, as they're called, and that's the British term, right? Some of you may, if you know, you've been in India and you hear about tanks, it doesn't mean duck for cover, it means that there's a reservoir. And this is an example of one. Where do you think this one is? This is a modern day one, needless to say.
It says Tunisia.
It's Tunisia, I said. See that? See that? Okay. Gives away his own punchline. Not good. All right. So then there's oases, and I love oases because it's the intricacy of the systems of solution that come up. So this is the Figuig Oasis, which is it's a somewhat unknown thing. It's part of Morocco actually, but it's tucked away right in one of the corners of Algeria. And these slides were actually taken by a friend and colleague of mine who was studying Morocco in the same period I was doing when I was doing my dissertation. That's what I started out doing. And so he went there, and these are these lovely pictures that he came. So this is what, so there's the reservoir on the one hand, and then there are these things that looks like freeways, right? I mean, it's just amazingly intricate. Look at the lower one in the lower right, and you can see that there are ways in which you can pile stones and stuff in the. So you had too much water. All right, it's not time for the other guy now. Boom, we're going to put the dirt in. Sorry if you didn't get enough. That's just the way it is. It's on a clock, right? So they have a water clock, and the water flow is timed, and that's the most rational solution. It's not first in and first out. It's a water clock system. A lot of the water toolkit that comes to the Americas through the lens of Islam, which means it brings the entire Middle Eastern toolkit of water management with it. And that means that one of my friends, maybe he was an anthropologist, I forget it, he got sort of fascinated with water regulations in New Mexico, and they're Spanish, of course. Well, what does that really mean? It means they're Spanish in the primary sense. That is, Spain used to be part of the lands of Islam. So it's actually the Middle Eastern toolkit, and the way in which water law works. And actually, somebody can help me out on this. If you're lawyers in the house and you know a little bit about this, or ask a friend. I believe it is the case. I have a friend who is an anthropologist of water and lived in California for a while, and he said that California water law is basically the same. It's basically Spanish water law, and the access to it, and who are the major and who are the minor recipients, and all of that kind of thing. All of that is language and thought patterns that come out of the Islamic toolkit. So anyway, there is this sort of funny little sort of California rebound that pops into the middle of the discussion. Then there's another element which has to do with Iran. So the Iranian plateau is by itself 1,400 miles across. So the media tends to talk about Iran as a tiny little place, and it's not a tiny little place. It has a population of 100 million people, and it is very much a large place, and it is. and it has an arid plateau, semi-arid plateau in the middle, and it's got a whole almost completely circled by mountains all around the edges of it, which has something to do with why the Iran-Iraq war never went anywhere, because those mountains were right there. All right, so the Iranian plateau then is a place where ancient Persia, various forms of that state lived for millennia. So how did they deal with the situation? That's the next question. Right. So here is the example, or here is the solution, which is something that is called, and this is the Arabic for it, actually, the Khanat, but it also is called a Khariz, Khariz. It has other names in other societies, so it crops up. It's in South Asia, in Pakistan and India. It goes as far as Morocco. I have seen Khanat in Morocco, the ancient major oasis community of Sijil Masa, which is a major desert port. Let's go back to that metaphor of ships of the desert. So Sijil Masa was a large city. What does large mean? In about 900 CE. And so it had a population of maybe 20,000 or something, which was quite large. And it was an oasis like we just saw, right? So it's that kind of an oasis. It uses Khanat to bring water in. So this is the cross section of the Khanat. So it taps into a water flow at the base of a hill, and then it directs it through a tunneling system. So a tunneling system that knows about gradient, right? 40, 50 miles into the plain. All right, so these are very important solutions to what is otherwise an almost insoluble problem. So Mesopotamia problem is solved because it has these rivers, but those rivers do not exist in the center of Iran, where most of these major cities are on the inside of the mountains, on the edge of this big shared plain. And so this is how that goes. And so you have access shafts periodically along the line. And so somebody has to dig down like a giant, manhole cover kind of thing. You take it off and you go down until you get to where the Khanat is, or the Khariz is. And then you clean out the dead cows and whatever else has crept in the meantime, and then get it nice and tidy, and then put the top back on, and you're good. And these people are specialists, and probably the job is passed in the family. And the Mesopotamian one, needless to say, all of these really depend upon one crucial thing, which is peace. Right. So no peace, no water. Right. And so that is a problem. So go ahead, Nancy.
So what's the original source of water? Is this water table?
Yeah, right. No, exactly. That's what the axis just came out on when I was grabbing the screen grab. That was the axis just on the inside. So that's where the water comes, and then what we're seeing is a subterranean thing. So alluvium, bedrock, etc. All of that is not something we would see. Anyway, that's I think I have one or more other slides of it too, just to give you a little bit more idea. Go ahead.
So the vertical tunnel is easy to imagine. How did they then make the horizontal tunnel, or is that natural?
Well, no, they would have to do it.
Somebody would have to actually.
Yeah, they would have to sort of
Oh my gosh.
convince the water that it needed to go in this particular direction rather than filtering around here, there, and the other place the way it does in Santa Cruz.
Is everything brick lined?
Hmm?
Was it brick lined or something like that?
I'm sure they would do things like that.
No.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And yeah, so I just discovered this slide. I wanted to put it in, but I had too many slides, so my bad. And it's called Viajes de Agua. Viajes de Agua are Khanats. And there is one, and I think it's, in the slide I had, it looked like it's become a place in Madrid, someplace in Spain, where people go, there's probably bars and stuff down there, and you can walk around under the city. It gets hot during the day. I'm not sure about the Madrid thing. I'm going to check that. But Viajes de Agua nowadays, right, have turned into a whole new repurposing of what this is about, right? But previously it was the water thing, right? And that goes. Well, here's another. So aqueducts are when you do it above ground, and qanats are when you do it below ground, right? So this is in Jordan, and I won't ask you where it is. And then here's some different images from India. So ancient Indian civilization, some of you may know this, many don't, and there's no bad in that. But the longer about 1800 or so BC, a little bit more in our direction, maybe, there was the city of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, right? And these are the ones that are always cited. They were found by British archaeologists. Somebody else knew them all along, but they just didn't want to tell the British. However, nonetheless, those peacekeepers did get in there and do their thing. And so we do know quite a bit about some of these sites. And they were ancient civilizations that were on, had a level that was similar to that of ancient Mesopotamians, and indeed they were in sea communication with one another. So like 1400 BC and so on, around that period. I think that's the number that just finally dropped in my poor little brain. And so, and the Egyptians also were in communication with Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. So so there are the world of ancient civilizations is not exhausted. Part of my point of referencing this is that it's not exhausted by just talking about Egypt and Mesopotamia. Oh, gee, I already knew that, big deal, right? But to understand that there is already a water toolkit, and it's big enough so that it reaches into South Asia. Things are moving in both directions. It's a little unclear to me who invents reservoirs, but reservoirs are a great thing because they're a place where rich and powerful people can show their power. Hey, come see my reservoir. You got a reservoir that big? Right. So it becomes a useful sort of tool, and it also is there are major. I have multiple images to choose from. Have any of you been to Marrakesh? Nobody. Okay. So anyway, they have a great big reservoir there, and as a sign of the power of the dynasty that ruled at one point. So there's this water wheel. Sorry, question. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you studied Tenochtitlan, modern Mexico City? I mean, they also had an irrigation system.
Exactly. Yes. No, I'm going to briefly touch on that, and I'm not going to do it any justice whatsoever. And probably you said more than I'm going to say. So anyway, so the irrigation system in India. So the one on the top, these kinds of things. This is an animal-driven water wheel. So the buffalo goes round and round and round, and there's a gear that intersects with the rod that pulls the water up, and then you give him some grain and tell him to stop for a bit, and then you drop the bucket and start all over again. And so that's the way you can get water out of the ground. And there are various different options on that. Those kinds of things, that's part of the water toolkit too. And that is in Egypt, and that is in Mesopotamia, right? So who gets it first? I don't think there's any point in even trying to wrestle over those questions, because first of all, they're undecidable. Okay, so ta-da. So Qanat technologies and their diffusion in Afro-Eurasia, portions of Afro-Eurasia, because we're not even talking about China. The person who put this map together did not have a brain big enough to include the rest of Asia, because Qanats also go all the way across. Once something's in the water toolkit, it can go anywhere. And of course, it goes lots of places. So particularly, there are notable, or there were, alas, until poor Yemen started getting pulverized in the last 10 or 15 years, major Qanats in Yemen. Someplace along the line in my lifetime, I saw an amazing film done by some famous European director, which was set in Yemen. It was mostly just sort of pictures of what Yemen used to look like. It was astounding. It's gorgeous, gorgeous place. And with Qanats and so on. So India, Central Asia, North Africa, that's the Maghreb, Spain. And then from Spain, we're globally bound, right? So off we go. So you can find examples of the water toolkit that are brought from Spain all the way to the Philippines, river. Spain had the Philippines. And you can find it, in South and Southeast Asia, because it hadn't quite diffused through the Middle Eastern lines, so it found other ways of getting there, particularly when cash cropping agriculture begins to come along, and suddenly we have real needs in a way in which ancient peoples didn't, or not ancient peoples even, but in which the peoples that were there at the time didn't necessarily need it, or they were ones that were more efficient than the people had. They already had quite useful ones for rice cultivation, for example. But well, actually, the slide on the right, which is not very visible, unfortunately, is from Peru, right? So Peru had their own water systems, needless to say, and ancient American water systems were very sophisticated and were done without beast of burden also. So there were no. So it's interesting if you think about the civilizations of the Americas. It's like somebody did an experiment just to sort of see what humans would do, and they came up with the state. They came up with calendars. They came up with very sophisticated astronomical observations and ways of tying that to various different cycles that they were interested in following. They did not have the wheel. They did not have beasts of burden, and they did not have iron. Right, but nonetheless, they had wars and armies and states and all that goes with, right? So it's like the civilizations of the Americas are kind of an experiment of what you can do when you're missing a few pieces. The population, this is now also in play, but for generations it was said that the population of the Valley of Mexico was something like 20 million or 22 million, different numbers come up, some lowball that number. That was when Cortez and company went in there. And within 100 years, it was 1 million. So if you want to know what the impact of Europeans on the Americas was, there's your little thought experiment. And needless to say, the Spanish were also merciless. So there's another component to this, which has to do with the technology of the Reconquista. Where does the Reconquista happen? It happens in Spain. It's about Muslims and Jews and getting them the heck out and stealing their stuff and enslaving them and so on. And that's a different lecture. All right, so boom, here we are in China. All right, so we're coming down the home stretch here. I think we've got about 5 or 6 more slides. And so everybody knows about the Grand Canal, and this is a somewhat late version of it. I don't think we have a date on it, but it covers much of China. And all right, so who's a Chinese specialist here? Who's been in China, knows about these things? Yeah. So why did they build the Great Grand Canal? What's it for?
Commerce.
Yeah. Well, say more. Actually,
And to control the floods from the rivers.
well, there's also that problem. Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Well, so no, but no. So it's this. It's that the civilization begins in North China. That's what we were all taught. Although there is now a line of historical interpretation that says nonsense. Those guys are outliers. Yes, they do have states and so on, but they're living on oats and barley and crap like that. They don't have any rice. I mean, come on. They aren't Chinese. What is going on here? It's sort of like Mesopotamia all over again, with worse things to eat. And so grains that are not even considered worth having. And so the Grand Canal is about turning North China, where the government is centered, into a space that receives rice that is grown in the south. So it's this rice is transferred up. The state and commerce allow the rest of China to be part of this, and it becomes a wonderful system. And there's nothing like it in any of the other major areas, right? So you can think of China as being a semi-continental space in its own, and as the technologies change over time, it gets to be more adept at laying hold of and holding onto the sort of Western desert components of it, right, way up into the steppe. But for a long time, that's not something they're very eager to do. It doesn't seem to have much in the way of payoff. There's lots of blank spaces in between that you don't particularly want to go to. So they don't. But China, qua China, the thing that's put together with the canal, is a remarkable society by itself. And then it also has, which we'll discover next time, a lot of maritime commerce going offshore, right? Which mostly the people that run the state are not real keen on. They would rather just keep focusing on doing what they do best. And sailor Chinese are not necessarily the way we're going to get rich and famous. And this is, I just put this in because it's remarkable. That's one thing. And it's from the Metropolitan Museum has this amazing scroll, which is, I don't know, we had a copy of it at UCSC. I don't think it's there anymore, but it's, you know, you could lay it out from one end of the room outside there to the other. And it depicts, it's called Spring Festival on the River. That's, if you just want to Google that sometime, you can find it. It has its own website. And it's extraordinary. And it's an artist, probably generations of artists working on this particular subject, which is following the river. And what is there, and what do you see? You see rural areas, semi-rural areas, you see agricultural areas. Here, what you're looking at, I can't blow this up anymore. Dead center is one of those water lifting machines. That's what's, so you see in the bottom and at the top, so this is the two-story one. And the river is slightly off stage. Actually, here, this is part of the river, so you can't quite make out the difference between land and water, but and this is the boat. All right, so anyway, that's it's fun to just go look for Spring Festival on the River sometime, and you'll see it. And I'm sure it's got, if you poke around online and you get fascinated with it, it'll tell you a whole lot about. It's about daily life, right? And that's the other thing about me as an historian, I suppose, is I hung out with anthropologists early in my career, and I got really interested in daily life and how daily life did not record the rise and fall of empires and all the things that everybody was supposed to be worried about. They were worried about putting bread on the table, and they were worried about whether their nephew who had gone off on this trip was going to come back, and if he'd come back rich or if he'd come back poor, and so on. So daily life gives you a much bigger sense of what people are all about. Here's some more of these water lifting devices. These are guys who are pedaling on a water lifting thing. And I think that is specifically Chinese. I don't know about this in the Middle East, the pedal system of lifting water, and this is one of the reasons why not, maybe has to do with the specific requirements at different stages in its growth of rice. Right. So rice is not just a general crop, it's very different than wheat and then the grains that grow in dry farming. But so it has to be irrigated, but it has to be not irrigated at other stages of its development. And there are different species of rice, and it does get complicated. But in any event, so these water lifting devices have to do with just keeping water in the rice field as you go along. Right, we are approaching conclusion here. So here we are finally, we made it to the Americas, and so this is Incan amazing terraced fields, right? Terraced fields exist in lots of contexts around the world, but this is a particularly difficult one to put together because we are in the high Andes, and how you manage this and how you water it and so on becomes a very significant problem, and it is solved by the Incas and buildings standing on the shoulders of those they defeated. So Incans are, I think, give me a number, but I think it's like 1400 to, you know, when they had the fatal encounter with the Spanish. So it's a 300-year society. It's being put together all the time. Eventually extends all the way down into the northern parts of Chile. All right, so there's that. And then now what I want to do is to go into my finishing kick. And so this is selling a concept, and the concept I'm trying to sell is the Islamic Green Revolution. And that's something that comes from an historian who wrote a book on the subject. And you can use this map, but this is the map of the transit zones, water and land, the Middle East to Africa, and to South Asia. It doesn't have the Chinese, Southeast Asia, et cetera, connections or steppe connections in the way in which it was nice to have. But still, right, it's quite extraordinary. So the Sahara, as you see, has got way more transit roads that are identified, and these would be camel, and then others along East Africa is fully part of this. Other parts of Africa, equatorial Africa, in jungle and so on, less able to be readily connected here, although we're finding out more about that stuff too. All right, so this is just the toolkit. Basically, the thing that makes possible, this is my suggestion. Andrew Watson is the man who wrote the book. But the tool, the agricultural toolkit, the water management toolkit, really is a presupposition of the Islamic Green Revolution. So the Islamic Green Revolution comes from about 900 or so CE, building forward until 1400 or thereabouts, and then stalls out. But it produces some empires that have great durability. The Ottoman Empire continues right on up into the 20th century, and for example, as does the Iranian one under different management from time to time. So here's some key elements of the Islamic Revolution. So it's based on the diffusion of the water management toolkit. That's my first point, and that's a profound one. And then it makes possible a new agricultural growing season, so that Egypt, that already at this point, is then able to go to 3 crops a year, which is astounding, right? Because Mother Nile just makes these things possible. And if you and then it's also that there are all sorts of new crops, and I'll tell you what those are in a second, because I think I have another slide on that. But there, I think, are 18 different food crops and 1 fiber crop that come along at this point, and you'll be amazed at what some of them are. It has important impacts on the kind of state that will best flourish with them and can manage these new societies. It leads to a repopulation of the area that had been decimated by different epidemics and other man-made causes, climate causes too, perhaps. And so big population recovery and planting of cities, rebuilding of old cities, all of that. So water management toolkit, this is just for reminder, are all of these elements. The thing I couldn't get to move in the slide is this under Qanat, there's something that in paren, which belongs under irrigation canals. That's the Arabic word for irrigation canal in the part of the Middle East that I know best. It has other names in other places. So there's macro and micro, and there's also meso. I didn't squeeze that in, but there are lots of different levels of organizing and controlling water. So here's the 16 food crops, right? And just think about that. Rice, all right, boom, right away we got population, right? And so a lot of the Middle East, unknown to the world, was dependent on rice. So the area in southern Iraq, for example, is a major rice growing area, and that just starts the list. Hard wheat, so a different kind of wheat, which can be grown under irrigation, right? Is now added to this, and lots of standard vegetables that we know and love get into this. Depending on climate, right? You can't have mangoes everywhere. If you're lucky and you're in California, you can, right? And so sugarcane, watermelons, and citrus of all kinds. Or now, if you stand back from this, there's one little question I wanted to just sort of float out there, which is, what are the 2 crops that are there that are going to be the drivers of economic growth in the very next period, so the 1500 thereafter period, or why?
Rice,
We
Cotton and some sugar, right? Cotton and sugar, right? So that's, think worlds of slavery, right? I think cotton and sugar is the old South. It's astounding, right? So sugar and cotton are really big. And they are not, they can be developed further and under slavery conditions, right? And other tweaks, obviously. The cotton gin and things like that later on. But so they're already in, but it's not only the idea of the water management, but it's also the crops that go with that are part of this toolkit, but they're part of it and not part of it, right? So, but we have to understand that the toolkit by itself makes possible huge developments, huge population increase, all kinds of things that flow from it. The new growing season, that's not everywhere, but it's some places. Some get to have two instead of just one. And lots of new cities, et cetera. All right, so here's where we end up now. So we started out with this civilizational view of the West is best. And we moved to something inevitably to this Asian-centered world economy. That's the world economy in the small, people, not including the Americas, right, and Oceania, but still world in the sense of where most of the people are. And Europe is weakly integrated into this. As late as 1450, even later, we could say, actually, until Columbus and Magellan and their gangs do what they do. So, and by 1750, this old game is over, and Europe rules the waves and rules the edges of Europe. It does not control the center. So the Mughal Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Ottoman Empire, major Islamic empires in the steppe areas, both on the Russian frontier and on the Chinese frontier, all still exist for several centuries thereafter, right? And make the transition to gunpowder weapons and so on. So there's lots of other things that one could look at. And I think that's our game. So thank you very much, and come back next time.